to episode 25 of Abbasid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamic history and a global medieval past. We're sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. We're also sponsored by Turath Publishing. Buy in time for Ramadan, a limited edition of Mufti Taqi Usmani's new translation of the Quran with explanatory notes in a deluxe thermo leather-bound hardcover. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit Turath Publishing at turath.co.uk and use discount code POD15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact Turath Publishing for details. I'm your host, Talha Hassan, a PhD student at the School of Honors and African Studies in London. Now on to the show. Abdullah Muhammad ibn al-Nu'man, better known as Shaykh al-Mufīd, was born in Baghdad around 948 Common Era. He would become leader of the Shia Muslim community and leave a lasting legacy in the development of Islamic jurisprudence amongst other fields. To discuss with me the life, works and legacy of Shaykh al-Mufīd is Dr. Ahab Bdaiwi. Dr. Bdaiwi completed his PhD at Exeter on Islamic intellectual history and is currently the Cook-Crone Research Bye-Fellow in ancient and medieval history at the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Dr. Bdaiwi.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Shaykh al-Mufīd was born in Baghdad around 948 Common Era during the Shia Buyid dynasty's de facto control of the Abbasid caliphate and 50 years before the so-called Sunni Revival with the reign of al-Qādir billāh in 991 Common Era. Tell us about the socio-political and intellectual context of his life.
As you rightly mentioned, he lived during the time of the Buyids. Now, this was a very important dynasty which rose to power within a generation of the Fatimids. The Buyids took control of Baghdad around 945 AD, and most of my dates will be in AD unless specified otherwise. Now, as you alluded to, the Buyids identified as Shia Islam was somewhat prominent in the worldview, and I say somewhat because that needs important qualifications. Unlike other movements before and after them, the Buyids did not accede to power by a revolutionary struggle. They did not always, this has to be said, they did not always prioritize Shiism. Of course, as non-Arabs, they were Persian, Turkic, some mixture of Persian and Turkic perhaps. So as non-Arabs, they could not claim the caliphate nor the imamate. And as such, they placed themselves as some kind of military administrators who were there to collect the taxes, to bring stability to territories or land which were previously under Abbasid dominion. The most famous Buyid ruler was Adud al-Dawla. He died in 983. The Abbasids, whether they feared him or respect him, they gave him the title Amir al-Umara. At least one Abbasid caliph did. The reaction to the Buyid taking power, of course, was interesting because there were a number of interesting transformations taking place in the Muslim world, particularly in and around the Iraq or Baghdad region. What we now identify as Sunni Islam was undergoing some significant transformations. And likewise with Shia Islam, what we identify as Shia Islam or Imami 12 Shia Islam was likewise undergoing serious and significant changes. So the non-Shia population, and of course I will abstain from using the word Sunni at this stage because as research has shown us, there wasn't as of yet around the time of Shaykh al-Mufīd in the 10th century a clearly demarcated community that identified as Sunni. So the non-Shia Muslims at the time, they weren't particularly hostile towards the Buyids, and the opposition in the most was not framed in sectarian diction. So that varies how people saw them. Nevertheless, there was a moment, particularly starting around the late 10th century, when there were clashes, violent clashes between the proto-Shia communities and the proto-Sunni communities. These clashes were often motivated by political concerns. These clashes were sometimes motivated by religious concerns. And Shaykh al-Mufīd was central to these clashes as they unfolded. So, for example, we know that when the Buyids took power, in their support of Shia Islam, they allowed or encouraged Shias to practice some of their rituals publicly. These included celebration of the day of Ghadir, which according to the Shia tradition was the day when the Prophet Muhammad appointed Ali as his successor. And Shia Muslims under the Buyids celebrated that, and the event was public, it was visible, it was loud. And naturally, that sort of got under the skin of the proto-Sunni communities. Some reacted violently to what they saw as Shia provocations, and sometimes what they saw as Shia sectarian vilifications of their symbols. In other cases, the Sunnis reciprocated, and they launched their own ritual communal practices. So to counter the day of Ghadir, we read in the histories, such as Ibn Kathir and others, that the Sunnis began to celebrate Yawm al-Ghar, the day supposedly when the Prophet and the Caliph Abu Bakr accompanied him to the cave, and that also became a momentous celebration for the proto-Sunnis. Likewise, when the proto-Shi'is celebrated Ashura to commemorate the death of Hussein at the plains of Karbala, the Sunnis would wait 8 days and they would mark the death of Mus'ab bin al-Zubayr, for example, in a similar fashion to the Shi'i counterparts. And sometimes scholars or the masses from either side or each side would target scholars and jurists. So young Shi'i thugs, if you like, would often go and annoy Sunni scholars. And young Sunni thugs would also do the same, and they would go and annoy Shia scholars, and that would erupt into violence. The sources describe those young group of people as ayyarun, sort of like a semi-militia, if you like, but not necessarily, heavily belligerent in that sense. That irritated the Buyid rulers, who more than once intervened, and at least 3 times they looked at Shaykh al-Mufīd, who was seen as the second most important Shi'i symbol in 10th century Baghdad. They looked at him and wanted to sort of demonstrate impartiality and justice by having him banished, although on all 3 occasions he was allowed to return to Baghdad. The sources are very clear that al-Mufīd was not responsible for instigating these violent clashes, although he was seen to describe someone, a 14th century Sunni historian, he was seen as Lisan al-Shia, literally the voice of Shiism in 10th century or 11th century Baghdad. And this is the context. So he wasn't terribly pleasant, at least from a social perspective.
Shaykh al-Mufīd had a tumultuous life, being exiled from Baghdad 3 times. He's also known as Ibn al-Muʿallim, son of the teacher, owing to his father's occupation. He dies in Ramadan 1022 Common Era and is buried beside the 6th Shi'i imam Mūsā al-Qāẓim. What do we know about the basic contours of the life and career of Shaykh al-Mufīd?
Well, luckily, al-Mufīd was a very popular teacher in Baghdad. And he trained a number of preeminent, celebrated, and towering intellectual figures in Shia Islam. These included people like al-Najashi, famous as a scholar of hadith and al-Rijal in Shiism. That also included someone like al-Tusi, a Shia polymath, people like al-Murtada, the celebrated Shia mutakallim and theologian, as well as someone like al-Karajiki and others. So we have very early biographies of Shaykh al-Mufīd that were passed down to us via his students, his immediate students, Tusi and Najashi, for example. So as you pointed out, we know he was born in 948. He was born in a city or a town between Mosul and Baghdad, known as Aqbara, and this is why sometimes he was known by the epithet al-Aqbari. He moved to Baghdad with his father quite early. His father was supposedly, if the sources are to be believed, was a respected teacher. We know that when he settled in Baghdad, he began to attend classes of some of the known Mu'tazili teachers and theologians, such as al-Rumani. There was an interesting anecdote which gives us a glimpse into who Shaykh al-Mufīd was, at least in how the Shia tradition came to remember him. So when he attended the session with al-Rumani, Shaykh al-Mufīd, after seeing a man from Basra, posed a question to al-Rumani. The man said to him, "What do you think about the tradition of Ghadir Khum, where, according to the Shia perspective, Ali was designated as the successor to the Prophet? And what do you think about the tradition of the cave, when, according to Muslim tradition in its entirety, Abu Bakr accompanied the Prophet as they were trying to escape the persecution of the Quraysh?" So al-Rumani said, "As for the tradition of the cave, it is knowledge, diraya. And as for the tradition of Ghadir, it is a report, ruwaya." Rumani continued, "The report, the ruwaya, does not oblige the assent that the knowledge, diraya, obliges. Hence, right, the knowledge takes more precedence, it's more elevated than a report, right?" So Shaykh al-Mufīd saw this as an answer that carried a sectarian tinge. So he decided, as a young man in his early days in Baghdad, to pose a question, a similar question to al-Rumani. So he asked al-Rumani, "What do you think, or what is the status of someone who kills a just imam?" So al-Rumani replied, "The killer is a grave sinner." Al-Mufīd then asked if Ali ibn Abi Talib, was a true imam. Al-Rumani replied in the affirmative. Al-Mufīd then asked, "What do you think then of the battle of the camel and Talha and Zubair?" Al-Rumani said they repented. So Mufīd responded, "As for the tradition of the camel, it is knowledge, and as for the repentance of Talha and Zubair, it is a report." So using a very similar mechanism, he tried to undermine his opponents by going back to a sacred Muslim memory and sort of rereading it for a sectarian tinge. This story could be legendary, it could be true, we don't know, but it's reported quite widely and quite early. So supposedly after this encounter, al-Rumani sent a note to one of al-Mufid's teachers, and he said, "Take care of this young man, he is al-Mufid, he is one from whom people draw benefits." So it seems that al-Mufid was breaking rank and causing, at least, or making the right noises in Baghdad. We know he taught in his house, sometimes in the mosque. When we look at the usual surveys of 10th century Baghdad, or 11th century Baghdad, I apologize, we come to learn that there were 5 major scholarly currents or scholarly circles, and al-Mufid's was one of the biggest. He attended classes of Mu'tazilis as well as traditionists, and likewise when we read, for example, the report or the history of Ibn al-Jawzi, we learn that many non-Shia scholars attended al-Mufid's session. And a significant indication that al-Mufid was highly regarded was when the sources, someone like Ibn Hajar, reports that his funeral was attended by 80,000 Shi'is. And of course, Ibn Hajar uses a less charming word. He says 80,000 Rafidis attended. And that is quite significant. That was perhaps the second largest funeral that we can sort of trace back to the 11th century.
Shaykh al-Mufīd has nearly 200 works attributed to him, although only 10 survive. He was known to debate opponents and left a lasting legacy upon Islamic jurisprudence. What do we know about these works?
Well, you're right. The sources ascribe up to 200 works to him. That includes, of course, his students, al-Najashi and al-Tusi, who provide us with a detailed bibliography of his writings, as well as their titles. However, I should just say more than 10 survive. To the best of my knowledge, 31 have been published. And a number of treatises of al-Mufid remain in manuscript form, but they are extant. We know where they are. For example, there's a wonderful majmu'ah kept in the Iranian libraries, and this is a codex containing a great many short treatises of Shaykh al-Mufid. Now, what we know about Shaykh al-Mufid's writings is they covered a wide range. He was, in the main, as you pointed out, a jurist, a theologian primarily, and perhaps a historian, a scholar of hadith, and a Shia polemicist secondarily, right? So in terms of theology, Mufid was quite prolific. He has a number of works in theology, the most known of which is Awa'il al-Maqalat, as well as Risalat al-I'tiqadat, or Tashih al-I'tiqadat. And these are attempts by Shaykh al-Mufid to underscore the rational as well as traditional underpinnings of Shia Islam. So what is clear throughout his writings is he is definitely influenced by Baghdadi Mu'tazilism. So in 11th century Baghdad, there were sort of three groups of Mu'tazilis. There were the Baghdad school, the Ikhshidiyya, as well as the Basran school, or also known as the Bashamiyya. So Mufid was more sympathetic to the Baghdad school. Now, I should say all of these schools, including the Basran, they were all in Baghdad as a city. So we find in al-Mufid's theology, for example, when the issues such as moral obligation is deliberated, the Mu'tazilis famously deliberated this question. How does a human being come to discover that he or she has a moral obligation? How do they enter the phase or the state of taklif? How do they become a mukallaf? The Mu'tazilis, at least the Basran school, as well as some of the Baghdad school and the Ikhshidiyya, they said one arrives at knowledge of the necessity of moral obligation by reason alone, unaided reason. Al-Mufid wasn't quite comfortable with that position. So his take was reason could be useful, for example, to help us arrive at the conclusion that murder is wrong, that we have to be grateful to those who show us favors, we have to avoid lying, and we have to be righteous. So Mufid's response to what he considered to be the extreme Mu'tazili position was, there are most certainly instances when reason or unaided reason could guide us to discover some moral obligations, and these were known as taklif al-aqli. But the vast majority of the moral obligations a Muslim has to uphold are discovered via revelation, via the scriptures. And here al-Mufid is emphatic to highlight the role of the Quran, as well as what he considers to be the infallible, the Prophet and the 12 imams. The imam in the theology of al-Mufid is a central figure. The imam is an interpreter, adjudicator, evaluator, as well as someone who makes necessary intellectual as well as religious interventions. At a time when the early Shia sources, the early Shia hadiths in the 2nd as well as the 3rd century were quite vast. I mean, by the 2nd century Hijri, that is roughly the 8th century Gregorian, the Shi'is had a vast literature, legal as well as theological literature. And there, when one reads it, and thanks to recent studies, we find that the Imam occupied a very prominent role in the spiritual, intellectual, and moral universe of the early Shi'is. So Mufid continues that legacy. He imbues the imam with a much more significant role than merely being a jurist or a leader, social leader of some sort. For al-Mufid, the imam is the final adjudicator, the final arbitrator, and the final religious authority in the absence of the prophet. And that is seen throughout. So al-Mufid, for example, spoke about moral obligations. When he speaks about in his Awa'il al-Maqalat, about the necessity of the imam, he's responding to Mu'tazili interlocutors who would often say to him, having the imamate is not absolutely necessary. Al-Mufid would respond back and say, absolutely, it's necessary. The imam must be infallible. When he was questioned by the Mu'tazilites, why must the imam be infallible? Al-Mufid said, well, if the imam practices or makes an error, if the imam falls short, then he has to be punished by another person. And how could this be if the imam is not infallible? In other words, how could anyone else bring hudud to an imam that would undermine the whole point of leadership? It's sort of like saying a president makes an executive decision, but when he falls short, someone has to step in and sort of correct him. For al-Mufid, in the religious realm, final authority has to rest with an individual who is beyond making errors. And he uses the word asma. And as well as other arguments which he puts forward, such as it would undermine the justice of God, because God was just to send an infallible prophet, so that when people fall short, they don't have a hujjah, they don't have a reason to dissent against God. Likewise, in the absence of the prophet, people could turn around and say, well, the prophet is gone, it's been hundreds of years. How is it that you were expecting us to arrive at correct Islam, given all the chaos, given all the sectarian strife, given all the vast differences in the world? And this is when al-Mufid would respond and say, that is why it was necessary to have an infallible imam. So these were some of the reasons he put forward, making rational arguments for the necessity of the imam, moral obligation, of prophecy, and many other finer points. In terms of his other side, his polemicism, there is very little doubt that every now and then Mufid would employ sectarian rhetoric in his writings, and not sectarian in a very sort of malicious, aggressive, combative way, but he was nevertheless someone who would openly pass very critical judgments of figures considered revered or considered important in Sunni Islam. And this is sort of indicated by what some of his contemporaries had to say about him. So as you know, some of his famous contemporaries included the likes of al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. When we read al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's obituary, you begin to learn the extent of the animosity between al-Mufid and his detractors. So al-Baghdadi says al-Mufid died in this year, 413. He was prolific. He called him Shaykh al-Rafida, the leader of the Shi'is, and someone who wrote profusely, and someone who promoted error and deviant ideas, and he was one of the imams of error. And al-Baghdadi continues, and thank God his soul was taken away, and now the Muslim world can rest at peace. We read sort of similar things in the supposed encounters between al-Mufid and his other contemporary, al-Baqalani, where, according to one Shia account, when al-Mufid entered a session where al-Baqalani was present, al-Baqalani said, قَدْ جَاءَكُمُ الشَّيْطَانِ, Satan has entered. So when Mufid overheard this, he responded and said, reading the ayah, we have sent the devils to sort of put them down. Interestingly, we read the story in reverse order in the Sunni accounts, that it was al-Mufid who said, قَدْ جَاءَكُمُ الشَّيْطَانِ to Baqalani. And that goes to show how polemics must be taken with a pinch of salt, but they are wonderfully fun to read. Mufid came at a time when Shiism was, as I mentioned earlier, undergoing a transformation. Shiism around the 2nd Hijri century and the 3rd Hijri century was more traditional than rational, in the sense that when you read someone like Shaykh al-Saduq, who was a teacher of al-Mufid, when Shaykh al-Saduq was asked about the utility of ilm al-kalam, he said, well, it's useful insofar as it allows the Shi'is to rebuke or repudiate the errors of their enemies or their opponents. And they must do so through the sayings and the teachings of the imams. This is how you use ilm al-kalam. It has to be orientated towards scriptures. Mufid enters, and then Mufid begins to inject Shia Islam with a more palpable, ubiquitous, rational tendency. And Mufid, when asked, or when he writes about the utility of ilm al-kalam, he said it is that which uses reason as well as scripture, reason that must be aided by scripture, to put down heresies and defend orthodox belief against detractions. So you can see the sudden shift where reason begins to sort of occupy a more prominent role than it did in the past. So Mufid is quite significant for many reasons in the Shia universe of religiosity, one of which is his sort of the subtle changes he brought to Shia epistemology and Shia religious modes of thinking, where reason became more prominent than it had been in the previous centuries.
Shaykh al-Mufid's land of birth continues to experience tumult between those who regard themselves as heirs to the conflicts of his time. He is commemorated annually on the 9th of September in Iran's official calendar. How do you evaluate Shaykh al-Mufid's lasting legacy?
It's a very good question. So in theology, in ilm al-kalam, Mufid is central. He trained a number of well-known Shia theologians, such as Sharif al-Murtada and al-Karajiki and others. And these are towering figures in the rational tendency of Shia Islam. And that rationality extends also to his jurisprudence. So for example, today one of the many memories of Shaykh al-Mufid in the contemporary Shia psyche is his writings on jurisprudence and his writings in legal matters. He has a treatise, for example, which outlined what one can do in order to work, or when one is forced to work with an unjust and an evil government. And he lays out a number of conditions. I have them translated somewhere, so I'll read out some of them here. So for example, he says, if the unjust or wicked government demands from a pious, righteous scholar that he offers help, if that help is positive, such as, for example, helping the orphans, ensuring justice prevails, then it becomes obligatory on that scholar to help this unjust government. If the righteous scholar is called upon to assist in acts of injustice and aggression, then it's forbidden and illicit for the righteous scholar to work with them. Is the righteous scholar allowed to take money and funding from an unjust government? Something I'm sure many of us could relate to today in our contemporary climate. And Mufid says, well, that depends. Is this money, for example, to promote knowledge? Is this money to promote something decent, something righteous that doesn't bring harm to the Muslim community? Then yes, you can. If it's for reasons which to do with sinister and insidious motivations, then you can't. And that is one of the instances where al-Mufid's theology and his legal outlook intertwine, as well as other legacies of his which I think are worth a mention are his writings in history. So he left behind a number of writings or historical chronicles, such as his famous biography of the 12 imams. That is one of the earliest, most systematic, and most complete biographical and accounts we have of the 12 imams revered by Shia Muslims. He has a number of writings on natural philosophy that deal with what we now would call physics, as well as philosophy of language, which have been quite studied quite extensively in places like Iraq and in Iran and Lebanon, and so on and so forth.
You are a co-editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Shi'i Islam with Professor Sajjad Rizvi. What are any other current projects listeners can
that's
anticipate?
Very kind of you to ask. So I have the book, which should be out, and of course I keep delaying it, and that is called Echoes of Late Antiquity. That builds on my research in my PhD days, and this looks at a number of thinkers in late medieval Iran, late medieval Shia thinkers, I should say, who revived ancient knowledge as well as Islamic knowledge in a way which I felt was quite interesting, and hence the title Echoes of Late Antiquity. And the current two book projects, aside from that, are the one you mentioned, the Oxford Handbook of Shia Islam. That is a huge tome, 45 chapters, almost 500,000 words, as well as another monograph, which I started on recently since coming to Cambridge. And this has to do with my interest in the pagans and monotheists of Arabia before and after Islam. So this monograph will study the mushrikun of the Quran, and it attempts to reconstruct their religion and ethical worldview and compare it with the Quranic notion of Tawheed, and see how this tension was eventually resolved by the Muslim tradition.
Dr. Bdaiwi, thank you for being a guest on the Abbasid History Podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.